All right. Thank you very much for tuning in to Ask GAO Live, GAO's online streaming interactive chat where we talk about new reports that the agency has issued. My name is Jeremy Clucci. I work in our public affairs office, and I'm here today with Stan Czerwinski, a director in our strategic issues team. Today we're going to be talking about GAO's latest update to our state and local fiscal outlook simulations. And before we begin the discussion, this is an interactive chat. We want to encourage you to submit any questions you may have. There are a few ways to do that. One is to send an email to askgaolive@gao.gov. You can also submit a question on Twitter by using the hashtag AskGAOLive, or right here in Ustream. If you're viewing on the Ustream platform, there's a social stream, should be to the right of the screen. You can ask your question there, and we'll do our best to get you a response in the 30 minutes that we have. So to start, Stan, thank you first of all for joining us.
My pleasure, Jeremy.
And I'm hoping you can give a brief introduction to why GAO prepares these simulations for state and local governments.
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. Glad to do that. As you know, GAO follows the federal dollar. And in terms of federal programs, a large number of the programs depend very heavily upon state and local governments. So the message that we have is that federal, state, and local governments are all in it together, and the fiscal condition of the state and local governments is essential to the success of federal programs.
And can you talk a little bit about the current status of state and local government's fiscal position and how GAO's model projects that's going to change over time?
Sure. Currently, the position is that the governments are under some stress. Our model simulates what will be happening in terms of pressures upon the sector, and what we're showing is continued stress over the time period of our simulations.
And I think we have a slide to illustrate that, so maybe we'll switch over to that.
Sure. Now, as you can see from the slide that we have, currently the line that shows the balance for the sector is somewhat below where it should be, but not dramatically. If you look over time, though, that line continues to slope downward. The message we have here is that the stresses upon the sector should be addressed earlier rather than later, because the longer you wait, the harder it's going to get. The one thing I want to point out at the start is that our model looks at the sector as a whole. We don't look at individual states or localities. Also, as you probably know, state and local governments are prohibited from running deficits. So we are not projecting that there'll be deficits. What we're showing is stress upon the individual states and localities because of the difference between their expenditures and their revenues.
Great. Our next question here is what sources of revenue are state and local governments currently depending on?
Well, I'm really glad we were asked that question because, as I mentioned at the start, the federal government depends very heavily upon state and local governments to carry out its programs. Conversely, state and local governments depend very heavily upon the federal government as a source of revenue. And I think we have a chart that we can show them on that one, Jeremy.
And it's up.
Good. As you can see from the chart, the states have a number of, and localities have a number of own source revenues. Their own source revenues primarily are income taxes, sales taxes, and property taxes. But if you look individually among the revenue sources, grants and aids from federal government are the single largest source of revenue to the sector. So again, that stresses the interdependency that there is between federal, state, and local governments, where the federal government depends upon state and local governments to carry out their programs, but the state and local governments depend upon the federal governments for the money to run the programs and help their operations in general.
All right, thank you for that.
Sure.
Our next question here came in via email. What do state and local governments spend their budgets on, and has that changed over time?
Oh, it has changed. I think I have a chart for that one too.
You do.
So
prepared for that one.
We're doing great so far. In terms of the sources of programs, if you look, the growth is showing up in healthcare. And this is actually a major point that we have in our model. For healthcare, our look out into the future is that if this trend continues of growing healthcare expenditures, there'll be essentially no way for state and local governments to cut down in other areas enough to handle the growing healthcare expenditures. There's another story or two that I wanted to point out here, and that is if you look at the education bar, that is by far the largest single expenditure for the state and local governments themselves. However, with the growing healthcare cost, that is being choked out a bit. There is some good news, though, too. If you look at income security, you'll see actually a decrease in what the state and governments have been spending income security. And you might recall that during the 1990s, there was a welfare reform package that went through. And what this shows is that when you do reform, and if you do it successfully, you can actually cut your costs, which has an implication for health care going forward.
All right, thank you. Our next question now came in via email. It's from Chris. And he asks, how much has state and local government employment dropped?
That wasn't something that we actually covered in this review. This review that we're doing here is a simulation of the sector as a whole, and of course employment is part of it, but we don't look specifically at that. However, GAO has done other work looking at state programs, and we hear anecdotal evidence of significant stress upon the employment levels. Some places even about 10%. And the point that I want to make here is if you look at the sector's importance to the U.S. economy, about 1 in every 7 jobs in this country is with a state and local employee.
All right, well, thank you for that response. We have another question that came in via email from Stephen, and he asks, how often does GAO update the state and fiscal outlook?
We update annually, Stephen, and this actually is the 5th year that we've been doing our model for the state and local sector.
All right, and a Twitter question now. What can be done to neutralize the long-term fiscal pressures on state and local governments?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And with our model, if I could just take a step back for a second, not surprisingly what we do is we look at revenues and expenditures. And what we have found is that on the long-term stresses, it really is expenditure driven. And the answer is actually pretty simple. It's healthcare. The healthcare costs are rising at such a significant rate that is the area that state and local governments are going to have to find cost containment if they're going to make their budgets have less pressure.
Chris has emailed with another question. What are the impacts of pensions and post-retirement costs to states?
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question, Chris. And actually, we just put out a report in the last couple of weeks looking at state and local pensions. The report is up on our web, gao.gov. In terms of pensions, there's some good news and there's some bad news. The good news is that the state and local pensions aren't a major driver of the fiscal position of the sector. The bad news is that the economy has been so rough in the past years that it has increased the pressure on the pensions. And what we found in the report that I just mentioned, that's up on the web for us, is that state and local governments have been taking a number of actions to change the contributions and the benefits for their pension plans, as well as trying to retool their investment strategies and expectations of investment, because it's those 3 things that really determine the fiscal health of pensions.
Another question via email. Recent news has talked about the impact of welfare reform on growing unemployment. Can federal funds fix these shortfalls?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is a question that is outside the scope of our review. As good as that question is, that's the one that I really can't answer in this forum.
Sure. All right, another question here. This questioner asks about the near-term fiscal issues that could affect state and local governments.
Yeah.
If you could talk and elaborate a little bit on those.
Yeah, that's a really helpful question. As I mentioned before, if you look long-term, the drivers are on the expenditure side. Conversely, if you're looking short-term, the real stresses on state and local governments have been on the revenue side. And it's intuitive, because if you think about the economy struggling as it has the past several years, you see unemployment had increased, which has an effect upon sales taxes and income taxes. If people don't have jobs, they're not buying things, and obviously they're not paying as much as income taxes because that's down. There is some good news there too, and that is we've seen a turnaround in the last couple of years, from the last couple of years, on the revenue projections for the state and local governments, where we're starting to see income taxes and sales taxes come up. There is one other major revenue stream that we've talked about before, and that's property taxes. Property taxes are primarily a source of revenue for the local governments. And with the economy struggling, particularly with the housing issues, we had anticipated property taxes declining. Property taxes actually had held their own for the past several years, but unfortunately we're now starting to see a decline in the property taxes. So that is a revenue stream, particularly for local governments, that's under siege right now.
All right, another question. What are the primary fiscal challenges driving state and local governments in the long term?
Well, in the long term, as I mentioned, it's on the expenditure side. And in a simple phrase, it's healthcare is the driver. If state and local governments working with the federal government can contain healthcare costs, they will be in a much more solid financial footing going forward. At the same time, there are a number of other expenditures the state and local governments have to deal with, their salaries, their other programs. What we're projecting there actually is fairly solid containment of those costs, which helps, but without addressing the healthcare issue, that they can't relieve their stress successfully.
And you've mentioned healthcare a couple times as a driver of cost. Can you elaborate a little bit on some of the issues there, unpack that?
Sure.
And I can pull up the chart on that too.
Sure. On healthcare, you obviously have the Medicaid program. As you probably know, Medicaid provides healthcare services primarily to low-income persons, and this is a program that's jointly funded by the federal and state government. That is a major piece of the healthcare puzzle. The other part, obviously, is the state and local employees themselves, because you have healthcare benefits for those employees and their retirees. So those are the major pieces. But again, Medicaid is the single largest.
All right, we have a question from email via email here from Catherine. She asks, what are some of the most positive indicators in local conditions?
Positive indicators. Well, probably the most positive would be in terms of the expenditure side, because what we're seeing there is local expenditures being essentially holding the line. On the revenue side, the local governments depend upon funds from state governments that are passed through to them, as well as their own source, which is primarily property taxes. Those are the picture's not quite as rosy, because we're seeing some stress in those areas. So I'd have to say on the expenditure side, it's probably the most positive sign.
And the next question, how concerned should we be about the fiscal pressures faced by state and local governments?
Well, you're asking GAO, and we're always very cautious. And this is a situation where actually the projections that we show are cautious and optimistic. So as challenging as what we're showing, there's a fair chance it could be worse. What I would suggest to look at here is the interaction between federal, state, and local governments, and to look at the overall picture that you have of the fiscal position of the state and local sector, as well as the position of the federal sector. And they're both heading into difficult territories. So the message there is that we should act sooner rather than later, because it just gets harder the longer we go.
This next question has to do with the models themselves. And so maybe you could take this opportunity to talk a little bit about those models. Sure. For the simulations. How does GAO account for uncertainty when projecting state and local fiscal outlook into the future?
Sure. What we do with our model is that we have tried to essentially mirror what goes on in the state and local governments as a whole. So what we then do is put in equations that match the different patterns and expenditures and revenues. We then populate those equations with data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. What we did in building the model, and this is an interesting story, is we went and vetted the model with all the experts we could find to see how it worked. And then what we have done since the model's been up and running is we look back and we see how well did the model fit actual. And then we make adjustments. So a long answer to your question is by looking back and by calibrating, we make adjustments as we go along. The other thing that we do too is we look at scenarios, because there are different things that can happen. Our model has a base case that essentially says things will remain as they are. There won't be changes to revenue policy or spending policy that's projected forward. But what you can then do is make assumptions that there will be different actions taken that have different impacts. So we then have essentially a sensitivity analysis that we run on top of it too.
All right, thank you for that. We have a question here via Twitter from Ryan. Ryan starts with a statement, "This looks terrifying." And then he asks, "Is it really as terrifying as it seems, or am I missing something?"
It's a bit scary, Ryan, and you're not missing anything. But the good news, I mentioned, the earlier we take the action, the easier it is to handle. And the thing that I'd point you to is that if you think about the first graphic that I showed, which was the line getting steeper and steeper below where it should be, it's harder and harder to fill that gap as we go along. So the quicker we can take some fundamental changes in the way we've done business, the easier it'll be.
And we have a question and statement here via email from Ryan. I'm not sure if it's the same Ryan because it came in via email, but this is what he says. "Can you clarify what we're supposed to take away from this report?" He says, "It seems like the projections are based on the assumption that states and localities won't increase their revenue or decrease their expenditures, but this seems like a strange assumption. They're required to balance their budgets,
Right.
so we know they will do this."
Right. That goes back to the opening statement that I made, Ryan, and that is we know that state and local governments are required to balance their budgets, and therefore what we have is simulations of pressure, not actual deficit. But what we show is growing pressure unless action is taken. And that's the takeaway, that we need to take some action earlier rather than later.
Another question via email. "What other kinds of GAO reports focus on U.S. government fiscal conditions?"
Sure. We actually do have a body of work looking at the federal fiscal position. And what we do also is that as we conduct our reviews in the program areas, we'll often take into account the fiscal position either of the federal, state, or local governments when we do that. And we have a web link on our site of GAO.gov that actually has the fiscal outlook for the federal government as a whole, as well as the state and local government. So if you go to GAO.gov and then look at our fiscal link, you can see some of that work.
Yeah, I think if you go to GAO.gov, there's a featured topics section in the lower right and a link to the fiscal outlook for the federal government, long-term fiscal outlook, and also for state and local governments. This is right there.
Great, thanks, Jeremy.
No problem.
You said it better than I could have.
I spend a little bit of time on the website. So, this next question also came in via email. "Are there any other sources for projections of state and local fiscal pressures, and how do they compare to those from GAO?"
Yeah, actually, our model is unique. We are the only place in the United States that can make these kind of simulations and projections.
Okay. So could you talk a little bit more about this chart, the projection? Is it, sorry, it's chart number 1.
Sure.
And in terms of the longevity that is projected here?
Yeah, and that actually goes back to the last question too. We project out for 50 years. So we can do long-term projections. There are some other places that can do some short-term estimates of what's going to be happening with the state and local sector, and those are very much in line with what we say, but we're the only ones who can take it out long-term. And again, our story is the further out you get, unless we take some action, the worse the story gets.
All right, thank you for that. In one of the later charts, which I'll pull up, it emphasizes education spending as being a major factor. Yeah. What can you say about trends in education spending?
Sure. There's actually two trends there. Education spending is the largest single spending component for the state and local sector itself. And there is federal funding that goes into education, but frankly, what the state and locals put into themselves is significantly larger than what the federal puts in. But the other trend that I want to mention is that when you look at the percentage of spending that state and locals are able to devote to education, that is going down. So what we have is a programmatic area that depends heavily on the state and local governments themselves with federal input, but still the states have a very, very big piece of this. But it's one that they seem to be able to fund less and less as time goes on.
And we received another question via email during that answer, I think referring to that chart. This person asks, why the increase in public safety spending?
Public safety spending is one that is very much funded by state and local sources themselves. And this is where the federal government doesn't participate as much as it does in some other programs. The why is something that we didn't look at, though.
All right. Well, that will wrap it up for today. Really appreciate you participating in this chat, and I want to thank everyone who's tuned in today and post questions via email and Twitter. We really value this opportunity to have a conversation with you about our new reports. We're hoping to do more of these moving forward. If you have any feedback about today's chat, we would really appreciate it if you could email it to askgaolive@gao.gov, and we'll take that into consideration as we look to how we can improve this format. Thank you again. Thank you, Stan. If you need any more information, please visit our website, gao.gov. You can follow our latest reports on Twitter, twitter.com/USGAO, and also on Facebook, facebook.com/USGAO. Thank you again.